Hi, I'm Peggy Matley, a quilter with the Miami Valley Art Quilt Network. Our quilt show, Suffragists and They Persisted, is in recognition of the 100th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote. Before I talk about our quilts, I would like to summarize our long fight to vote. First, the meaning of suffrage, which means the right to vote. During the 80-year struggle to achieve the women's right, early supporters were called suffragists. After being denied the right year after year and being persecuted, jailed, and beaten, the more radical suffragists adopted the suffragette title, which had been used to mock women who broke social norms. For our show, we used suffragist. The fight for women's rights can be traced back to Abigail Adams in 1776. Her letter to husband John urged the Continental Congress to include women in the emerging code of laws, with the famous quote, "I desire you would remember the ladies." You might want to look up his reply. In the early 1800s, women had few rights under the law regarding property, education, employment, or marriage. In the 1820s and 30s, most states gave voting rights to all white men, not just landowners. During this time, many reform groups were raising social and moral issues. Women involved in these movements, particularly the anti-slavery movement, realized that women's rights were a logical extension of these interconnected humanitarian concerns. After Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott were denied as delegates to the World Anti-Slavery Convention, they organized the first Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls, New York in 1848. 300 men and women gathered and produced a controversial declaration of sentiments, a list of rights denied women regarding property, education, employment, religion, marriage, and suffrage. It was signed by over 60 women and 30 supportive men, including Frederick Douglass, and was patterned on the Declaration of Independence. In 1870, the 15th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution guaranteed Black men the right to vote. The women who had been advocating for equal rights for all citizens were not included. This leads up to the 50-year struggle for suffrage that we portrayed in our quilts. Each artist picked a suffragist whose life and work were meaningful and of interest to them. Although most were not well known, they each contributed in unique ways to the cause. We were excited to know more about each phenomenal woman and hope that you are too. We will now give you a quick summary of the suffragist quilts and artist notes, but hope that you will later find more detail on our website, mvaqn.com. The first quilt we will look at is about Maria Miller Stewart by Peggy Matley. Maria Stewart was an African-American woman born free in 1803, but as a 5-year-old orphan was bound into servitude to a minister's family. Despite no formal education, she became a teacher, writer, abolitionist, and women's rights activist. I chose Civil War reproduction fabrics for this quilt. It depicts her famous 1832 Boston lecture to the New England Anti-Slavery Society. She was the first American woman to publicly address a mixed gender and race audience on political matters, which for the times was very shocking. The close-up shows her speaking to an audience depicted by hats in the foreground. This shows a book on Maria Stuart if you are interested in more information. This next quilt is about Lucretia Coffin Mott by Ann Diller. Lucretia Mott was a powerful woman with an old-fashioned name but a modern sensibility about human rights for all. How to portray such a multi-dimensional pioneer? Anne decided to use a quilt that her mother made years ago before her Alzheimer's diagnosis. Her quilt featured 15 embroidered women's hats. She repurposed 9 of them by taking them apart and sewing them into a new quilt. In the few available photographs of Lucretia, she always wore her Quaker bonnet, which is portrayed in the middle square. As a Quaker, she believed in the inner light, or individual moral responsibility, which Anne represented by rays radiating from her. The ladies in the quilt now represent the many hats that Lucretia wore. These close-ups show her as a mother of 6 and co-founder of Swarthmore College on the left, and as a suffragist on the right. These show her as a women's rights convention leader on the left and a civil rights activist on the right. The hat with the dove shows her as a Quaker minister. She described herself as a heretic as she defied social norms, fought injustice, and bucked religious traditions. On the right, it shows her as an abolitionist. On the left, she is shown as a feminist, and on the right, as co-writer of the Declaration of Sentiments and famous speaker and author of Discourse on Women. For more information, this is an excellent book about Lucretia. The next quilt is about Alice Burke and Nell Richardson's road trip across the United States of America, done by Deb Bentley. Alice Burke was twice widowed by age 26. She subsequently spent years speaking on behalf of women's suffrage. In 1916, she and Nell Richardson made a road trip around the entire United States in a yellow Saxon, speaking for women's suffrage. Alice did most of the auto maintenance herself. Look at the background collage of newspaper articles about their remarkable trip. This quilt depicts the ladies in their car along with their mascot, a cat named Saxon. Their long road trip is shown on the map in black and white quoting and includes photos of their christening event on the top and triumphant return on the bottom picture. There is also a children's book that tells their story. Martha Coffin Wright. This quilt was made by Melinda Loxmiller. As Melinda researched the suffragists, she found an online image of the Declaration of Sentiments, and her interest was piqued by the final name in the list of signers, Martha Wright. She discovered a biography entitled A Very Dangerous Woman, Martha Wright and Women's Rights, and began planning her quilt. Martha was the youngest sister of Lucretia Coffin Mott. The sisters shared Quaker upbringing with a deep commitment to social justice, suffrage, and abolition activism. Martha lived most of her adult life in Auburn, New York. After she was left widowed with a baby daughter, she married attorney David Wright, who encouraged and supported her social activism. Even with 6 children, she was a prolific letter writer. She once wrote to her sister Lucretia that she had learned of a newly invented sewing machine, and "if it is anything I can manage, I will have one, and a sweeping and dusting machine too, if there are any in town." Committed suffragists with families to care for would have appreciated our modern appliances. She also frequently hosted Frederick Douglass at her home. In the summer of 1848, Jane Hunt invited Martha, her sister Lucretia, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Mary Ann McClintock to come to tea to discuss their common interest in furthering women's rights. Their discussion became the foundation for the Declaration of Sentiments. This gathering became known as the Second Tea Party that shook the world. Melinda constructed her quilt on a background of cream-colored home decor fabric. The appliques highlight significant markers of Martha Wright's contribution. Martha wrote letters advocating for suffrage and abolition newspapers. She corresponded with active suffragists and abolitionists. Her outspoken writings and activism in the community may have been what provoked a neighbor to dub her a very dangerous woman. However, her letters, many of which survive, preserved much history related to the activities of the movements. Besides the image of Martha, the teapot holds a representation of the invitation from Jane Hunt. The image of the 2007 House resolution marking the 200th anniversary of her birth lists her many significant contributions. The image of the Declaration of Sentiments includes the sentiments and the signers. The script above the glove and pen on the quilt is the last sentence on the Declaration. Firmly relying on the final triumph of the right and the true, we do this day affix our signatures to this declaration. Amelia Jenks Bloomer, another quilt made by Melinda Loxmiller. Amelia Jenks, born in New York into a Presbyterian family, was well educated for a woman of her time. Her husband, newspaper editor Dexter Bloomer, from a Quaker background, encouraged her to write. In 1849, she began publishing The Lily after being recruited by several women's groups. The Lily, the first U.S. newspaper by, about, and for women, became the venue for many radical women writers. In 1854, Dexter's work took them to Mount Vernon, Ohio. She continued her advocacy for the advancement of women. While publishing The Lily in Ohio, she hired women to work for the paper and persisted when the male workers protested and went on strike. In the hope of incorporating images of the lily in her quilt, Melinda traveled to the Knox County Historical Museum in Mount Vernon to view their collection of the lily. She transferred photos of relevant articles from the lily to fabric to create the blocks in the quilt. They make interesting reading. The lily became the voice to transition acceptable women's garb from long skirts known as mudders to a costume of shorter skirt with loose pants underneath, leading to modern women's wear of jeans and pantsuits. Thus, the early pants worn by American women became known as bloomers, and Amelia was ridiculed when she wore them in Mount Vernon. Lucy Stone. This quilt was made by Jennifer Greenup. Lucy Stone was an orator, abolitionist, and suffragist, known for her determined and tireless work in advocating for equal rights for all people. She was publicly abused by angry mobs who opposed the content of her lectures. She endured having books thrown at her head and being doused with cold water in the winter when she was on the street. Married to suffragist Henry Blackwell, a signer of the Declaration of Sentiments, she was the first known American woman to keep her maiden name after marrying. Jennifer created her dramatic quilt presenting text from Lucy Stone's last public speech. The speech addressed the 1893 Women's Congress at the Chicago World's Fair. Her words are as important today as they were in 1893. Victoria Claflin Woodhull. This quilt is by Janet Lasley. Victoria Woodhull was a radical feminist who questioned accepted social norms and law. Having been married 3 times, she held views outside the norms of her time. In 1872, with suffragist and abolitionist Frederick Douglass as her running mate, Miss Woodhull ran as equal rights candidate in the election for U.S. President. 2 quotes that say much about her views and challenge to the norms. She asks why a woman is to be treated differently, and I ask the right to pursue happiness by having a voice in that government to which I am accountable. Electra Collins Doran. This quilt is by Chris Landis. A Daytonian, 18-year-old Electra Doran was looking for a job. What employment was deemed acceptable for a young woman at this time? Electra found that when she was hired as a librarian for the Dayton Public Library in 1879, it was a good fit. In 1896, she became the head librarian for the system. She became a model of the ability and competence of women in leadership positions and had an extraordinary impact on the library system. She made many innovations in the operation of the system and established a librarian training program. She created the largest collection of suffragist materials in the United States. The collection is housed in the Dayton Metro Library Dayton Room. In 1997, she was inducted into the Dayton Walk of Fame. In 1999, she was inducted into the Ohio Women's Hall of Fame. In 1928, the North Dayton Branch Library was dedicated in her honor for her lifetime of work for the citizens of Dayton. It is one of the few public buildings in the United States named for a woman. The quilt depicts the North Dayton Branch Library and other Dayton library buildings that benefited from the work of Electra Doran. Frances Watkins Harper. This quilt was done by Carol Schleppe. Frances Watkins Harper's poetry reminded Carol of Paul Laurence Dunbar's work. Research showed that she is considered his precursor in African American literature. Frances' lifespan is divided roughly in half by the Civil War. She was born a free black woman in the slave state of Maryland. She was classically educated at her uncle's school till her early teens. She supported herself most of her life, except for the 4 years before she was widowed, by teaching, speaking, and writing poetry and fiction. Public speaking was not easy for a single African American woman. In 1854, she was hired by the Maine Anti-Slavery Society as a speaker. She now traveled and lived with white women of a similar mind. They worked hard. At one time, she gave 31 talks in 23 cities in 41 days. Amazing. Can you imagine traveling in those long dresses by coach or train, and maybe with only one dress? Frances Harper gained national prominence in 1866 when she addressed the 11th National Women's Rights Conference. Her address, "We Are All Bound Up Together," expressed her desire to see equality for all races, sexes, and classes. In the quilt, she is featured sitting at a writing table in front of her bookcases. There is a stanza from one of her poems, John and Jacob, a dialogue on women's rights. The quilt was constructed using fusing and raw edge machine applique. Her hair is embroidered with black wool. For more information, here is a book of her writings. Ida B. Wells Barnett was depicted by Maxine Thomas with several symbols of Ida B. Wells' life. The red schoolhouse for her job as a teacher to support her family, and a typewriter for her work as a journalist and muckraker. And ropes for her efforts in documenting lynchings in the United States. The train recalls that Ida B. Wells was forcibly removed from a train. She sued the train company and won a $500 settlement, but she lost that on appeal. A century before Rosa Parks refused to move from her seat, Ida Wells and others stood up or stayed seated for their rights. Joni Kreitzer, the artist, selected Gloria Steinem's grandmother, Pauline Perlmutter Steinem, for her quilt. Joni benefited from an affirmative action program in the 1980s and trained and worked as a heavy equipment operator. Joni also corresponded with Gloria Steinem while working on the quilt. Pauline Perlmutter Steinem immigrated to the United States from Russia via Germany. The quilt features a portrait of Pauline Steinem. This is a sign displayed at demonstrations at the White House, reminding President Wilson that 20 million American women did not have the right to vote. Pauline was the first woman elected to office in the state of Ohio, the Toledo Board of Education. In her later years, she returned to Germany and rescued Jews until her death in 1940. As with Joni, Linda Morgan had a personal reason for selecting her subject, Rachel Brill Ezekiel. Rachel's granddaughter, Judith Ezekiel, was Linda's professor for several classes in women's studies at Wright State University. Rachel's training as a stenographer provided her with a livelihood, but also gave her entree into women's rights organizations. Her work included writing for newspapers and magazines, organizing, and working on petitions and letters. There are many details to be sure to note in this quilt. You can see the suffragist parade through the window. The hand tatting done by Linda on Rachel's dress. Praise of Rachel's work from Carrie Chapman Catt in a dedication in her book Woman Suffrage and Politics. And note Judith Ezekiel's book in one of the suffragists' hands. Elizabeth Arden, born Florence Nightingale Graham, immigrated from Canada and founded her cosmetics business. Ronnie Doyle created her design on the computer and then printed the design onto fabric. She then added the white dress and finished with machine quilting. Notice the lip prints. Arden provided each woman in the 1912 New York City suffrage parade with a tube of bright red lipstick. This at a time when nice ladies did not wear makeup. Notice the definition of suffrage, the iconic red door, the white dress and hat, and the gate. We will take a closer look at the gate later. In addition to this quilt, Ronnie also made a scrapbook for the exhibit. Winona Marlin was born in Greenfield, Ohio in 1877. When she was living in New York City, she was an active suffragist, writer, and journalist. She participated with the Silent Sentinels in 1917. Winona was able to vote for over 20 years until her death in 1945. Helen Willis features Winona making a speech. Winona wrote to the New York Times in 1915 explaining, "The fact that many men today regard the vote with such little respect is partly due to the fact that they never did anything to earn it." Brian Parton quilted this piece. One of the results of the suffragist movement and its demonstrations was music, literature, and art. Helen Casts Her Ballot is an example of sheet music of the times. Helen Willis shows us the cover of the sheet music published in 1916. The chorus promises, "When Sister Helen casts her ballot, good night war and welcome peace." Mother Goose may be stretching the term literature, but the New York State Woman Suffrage Party published Mother Goose as a suffragette. The cover shows the Knave of Hearts wearing a sash of opposition and the Queen of Hearts with a sash for suffrage. The Queen of Hearts has made some darts and shoots them straight each day. The Knave of Hearts has felt her darts and fast is giving way. As part of this project, Mother Goose Revisited, Miami Valley Art Quilt Network created a dozen quilts illustrating some of these Mother Goose for suffragettes. This is the program for the woman suffrage procession held in Washington, D.C. the day before President Wilson's inauguration in 1913. Alice Paul and Lucy Burns organized the woman suffrage procession, the first large march in Washington for political purposes. There were 8,000 marchers and 500,000 viewers, but it turned to a near riot due to not enough police protection. Alice Stokes Paul, while studying in England, joined their militant Women's Social and Political Union. She was arrested and jailed, but she learned their tactics about civil disobedience and hunger strikes. Back in America, she broke with the National American Woman Suffrage Association and organized a more militant National Women's Party. In 1917, National Women's Party began the first White House picket, known as the Silent Sentinels. For almost 2 years, 6 days a week, women dressed in white stood in silence with their banners outside the White House. The Silent Sentinels were arrested and imprisoned. Alice Paul was sentenced to 7 months and began a hunger strike. Helen Willis illustrates the college day on the picket line, February 3, 1917. Featured in this close-up are representatives of Washington College, Leland Stanford, Bryn Mawr, and Swarthmore, standing mute for their 4-hour shift. The pressure on President Wilson led to his support for the 19th Amendment. The quilt, Alice Paul, by Fran LaSalle, depicts Alice Paul sewing a star on the women's suffrage flag. After each state ratified the amendment, the members would sew on a star. Alice Paul continued fighting for civil rights for men and women throughout the world until her death in 1977. From Fran's notes, the most difficult job for me in constructing an art quilt is the decision regarding what my quilt will be about. Fran had many options with Alice Paul. The quilt is completely constructed from cotton fabric using raw edge applique. Thread painting was used to enhance areas of the quilt. The face and hands of Paul were colored with Prismacolor pencils. The Jailed for Freedom pin is seen in Ronnie Doyle's Elizabeth Arden scrapbook and in the background of her quilt. Alice Paul and others who were jailed were awarded the Jailed for Freedom pin by National Women's Party in December 1917. Next, from North Carolina is Gertrude Weil, a little-known force in the suffrage movement. She is most likely unacknowledged because she fought in a state that failed to ratify the 19th Amendment. Gertrude was aware that the Southern women would not take to the antics of those in the North. Instead, she hosted meetings in her parlor. She was Jewish in a predominantly Christian community, but she and her parents were well integrated into both Jewish and Christian society, socially and politically. She remained unmarried by choice. She opened the minds of many in North Carolina and saw her efforts rewarded in 1920 when 120,000 North Carolina women registered to vote. She established the North Carolina League of Women Voters. The total vote in 1916 election was 18.5 million. The total vote in the 1920 election was 26.8 million. That was an increase of 8.3 million votes. The quilt, Suffrage in a Southern Parlor by Shannon Naik, depicts Gertrude Weil sitting at her desk amassing letters to persuade political officials and other prominent members of society to join the cause of women's suffrage. The women's faces are photographs printed on fabric. The artist, Shannon, is in the center, stitching sashes as she imagines she may have done had she been alive at the time. And two of her friends are with her. Their images are seen on the other two women. The top was hand-stitched, fused, and machine quilted. When we decided to recognize the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, Chris Zurbuchen contacted Scott Sanders, archivist at Antioch College, inquiring if there was an alumna suffragist. He introduced Chris to Olympia Brown, class of 1860, a most remarkable woman and his favorite Antiochian. She is recognized as the first female ordained minister in the United States, 1863. She is one of the few early suffragists who lived to vote in the 1920 election at the age of 85. This is her Antioch College graduation photo. Chris believes that Olympia became a public speaker in her first-year English class. The instructor assigned in-class orations and readings, stating, "All the young men will be required to give speeches before the class. The young women must bring manuscripts to class and read from them. Olympia did not agree and delivered a rousing oration from memory with her manuscript rolled up in her hand. An orator is born. She married but kept her maiden name, had 2 children, and led a Universalist congregation in Racine, Wisconsin. She resigned in 1887 at age 52 to devote her time to women's suffrage. She joined the militant National Women's Party and stood as a silent sentinel in front of the White House. Olympia adopted the bloomer girl fashion, a pants-skirt combination, which was ridiculed by fellow students and locals. It was comfortable and practical, but also scandalous. She and her friends took long walks for exercise, as physical education was not available for Antioch College women. Chris's quilt places her in bloomers beside the Cascades in what is now known as Glen Helen. Since most of our audience would be local to the Miami Valley, many would know the Cascades and feel a kindred spirit with this young woman walking the glen. The construction method is raw-edged applique. It is fused fabric, embroidery threads, and free motion stitching. The dragonflies are in the fabric. Honorable Simeon D. Fess, a staunch prohibitionist, worked for women's suffrage, child labor laws, workmen's compensation, and minimum wage legislation. Remember, this was an era when children worked in mines and factories. He was president of Antioch College from 1906 to 1917, Ohio representative to Congress, then U.S. Senator. He is buried in Glen Forest Cemetery in Yellow Springs. He became involved in politics during the 1912 Ohio Constitutional Convention, which included an amendment for Ohio women's suffrage. It failed. The Dayton Metro Library Archives has reproduced the Dayton newspapers of this era. It is a wonderful view into our history with both pro and con opinions. Chris Zurbuchen honors another Antiochian with this quilt, a bouquet for a suffragist. The flowers are vintage 1950s cross-stitch floral coasters appliqued to a cotton background. Chris thought they made a nice bouquet. Many thank you notes were sent to Dr. Fess for his efforts. One note from the National Women's Party says, "I know of no one in the United States Congress whom I feel has been more ready to help suffrage than Dr. Fess, and I know of no one who has given that help more definitely and effectively than he." And here's the result, a headline from the Washington Herald announcing Congress passed the 19th Amendment, June 6, 1919. But now the states need to ratify the amendment. The 19th Amendment states, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex." After over 70 years of struggle, these words are now ready for the U.S. Constitution. The amendment has passed the Congress in D.C. It now needs to be ratified by 3/4 of the states, 36 at that time. The background of Carol Schleppy's quilt is copies of newspaper articles and headlines of the long fight for suffrage. The border is a chronological listing of the state-by-state voting results on ratification. Beginning on the right-hand side and reading clockwise are the state's votes by month. Note Ohio is one of the first in June 1919. Note the following month there is a line through Georgia. They voted not to ratify. Continue to July 1920 and you see 3 southern states voting no. However, Tennessee voted yes on August 18, 1920. But before we move on, note that some states did not approve the amendment until the 1970s and Mississippi in 1984. But now, to celebrate, Harry T. Byrne is the hero of the day. He listened to his mother's advice and voted for the amendment, a decisive vote yea after several deadlocked votes. The last step to finalize the law was the certification of the Secretary of State, and the amendment became part of the Constitution. In order to understand the long, slow journey to women's suffrage, I decided to create a quilt showing highlights of the struggle along with the suffragists of the time period. The fabric was leftover Civil War reproduction fabric from my Maria Stuart quilt. Along the trail, the events of the suffrage movement are noted. Outside of the trail are other significant events of the time. Each square on the trail represents all of the unnamed women and men who worked for suffrage and equality. On the right side are portraits of some of the leaders of the movement. The historical events are machine embroidered. The people's names are also machine embroidered. Please note the inclusion of today's women's rights movements with the pink kitty hat. We got the vote. Now equal pay. The right to vote came 100 years ago, but not equality, particularly in wages in many fields of employment. Harriet Knudsen asks about equal pay with her quilt featuring the image of Susan B. Anthony on the dollar coin. Harriet used digital images, machine embroidery, and a silver Sharpie to create this quilt. The people who struggled for years for this amendment actually hoped for more than just voting rights for women. So we will still persist in seeking equal rights and justice for all. As Frances Harper reminded us in 1866, we are all bound up together. The suffragists in our exhibit that have Ohio connections are listed here. Here are some of the members of the 19th Amendment Committee. The sashes were made by Melinda Loxmiller. Here are some of the quilters who contributed to this exhibit at the Dayton Metro Library opening.